Hi there, my name is Jimmy Bonero, and in this video we are going to create an auto-store configuration that will send files to an email address using Exchange Web Services, where users will be impersonated as if they sent the message. Before we move into the auto-store setup, at a very high level, Exchange Web Services is an application programming interface that developers can use to communicate with Microsoft Exchange. Exchange Web Services is exposed on an Exchange client access server and provides methods to interact with Exchange mailboxes. One way to look at Exchange Web Services is that it is the latest way for a client to communicate with an Exchange server. Starting with Exchange 2007, this is also available in Exchange 2010 as well as 2013. You might be familiar with other ways in which client-server access with Microsoft Exchange has been traditionally established, such as MAPI, CDO, or WebDAV. Besides Microsoft Exchange, web services are used in many or with many familiar names, such as Amazon, Facebook, Twitter. They all use web services today. And there's a bit more to web services, but generally speaking, because this interface is very lightweight and messages occur over the internet, my guess is this technology is going to be around and relevant for quite some time. So let's move on to the topic of this video, and that's sending email using our send to mail recipient route component and configure impersonation using Exchange Web Services. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go build our configuration file. So I'll click on New, and we're going to use auto capture. And we're going to use our send to mail recipient component. You want to make sure that you check your software updates, because the send to mail recipient component was updated in February of 2013, which provided the Exchange Web Services method to connect to Exchange. So let's go ahead and set up our auto capture. We're going to create a new form, and we'll call this send to mail EWS. I'm going to add two fields. The first field we're going to call mail from. We'll make that a string list. And I've already got a list of users in my environment that we're going to add. And what this mail from will do is this will represent who the message is going to come from. The next field that we're going to do is mail to. We'll make that a string list, and we'll use that same list. Now let's go ahead and go to our send to mail recipient component, and here what we're going to do is we're going to add a server. And when we add a server, you'll notice that we've got Exchange Web Services in the available choices, and this is the one we're going to choose. So when I select that, what we want to do is configure this first. The auto discovery based on email address, this is going to be based on putting in an email address in that environment where we've got an Exchange server. So what I'm going to do is use my administrator account. Alright, and then what we're going to do is we're going to test the auto discovery, but before we do that, we're going to need to put in a username and a password and a domain. If I don't do that, we'll get a message that says that we cannot resolve the email address and that the account credentials are not set. So here what we're going to do is we're going to use our service account. Now in this case I'm using administrator, but it doesn't have to be an administrator. This could be a normal domain user. It does not have to be an administrator, but this account will need to have the impersonation enabled on the Exchange server by the Exchange administrator. So at this point I've got my credentials, and I'm going to click on Test Auto Discovery, and what will happen is it'll take the information, contact the Exchange server, and what it'll do is it'll resolve the URL that we're going to need in order to communicate with Exchange Web Services. So I'm going to click yes to change the URL, and what will happen is it'll switch over from auto discovery to URL, and it'll plug in what we need in order to communicate with Exchange Web Services. Alright, so at this point, normally we would say we're not going to impersonate. We're just going to go ahead and just send mail as that, and send it on that way. But what we want to do is we want to impersonate the user. And we have three different ways through Exchange Services that we can do that. One is going to be with the user principal name, the email address, or the SID of that particular user. What we're going to do is we're going to keep this simple, and we're going to choose email. And that list of the email from and the email to is what we're going to end up using. So in my auto capture component, I could use mail from as how we're going to impersonate during runtime. So at this point, when I click on test connection, we need to provide the impersonate as with a valid value. And that impersonate as, when I'm testing, I want to use an actual account. In this case, one of those users was John Smith. When we test the connection, you'll notice that we're unable to connect to the Exchange Web Service, that there was an error. The account does not have permission to impersonate the requested user. So what happened was we reached out to Exchange, we used the administrator account, and we tried to impersonate as this account. And on the Exchange side, administrator is not allowed to do that. So even in a default installation with your administrator account, we can't impersonate unless we explicitly define that on the Exchange server. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch over to our Exchange server, and we're going to configure that. Normally this would be done before we get to this part. So on our Exchange server, what we're going to do is we're going to open up the Exchange Management Shell. This takes several seconds to fire up, and once it's ready and connected, then we'll be able to get started with applying the new management role assignment for the administrator account. So what I'm going to do is I've already got this on my clipboard. All right, and what we've entered in is we're creating a new management role assignment. The name that we're going to give it is called Test Impersonation Management Role. For the name, anything can be placed here. This is something that we're assigning. This value is anything that we want it to be, but we want to give it a name that will make sense when we come back on the Exchange server at a later time to determine what exactly this is. And the role that we're going to give it is we're going to give it application impersonation. And we're going to give this role to this particular user. In this case, it's the administrator account. And again, this could be a normal user account. It doesn't have to be the administrator account. That's just what we're going to roll with for this video. When I press enter, it'll go ahead and assign that role to this particular account. And that's it. That's all we need to do. So we'll go ahead and switch over to our AutoStore server. Okay, and now that we're back on the AutoStore server, one thing to keep in mind is that when we get ready to impersonate as a particular user, when we made that change on the Exchange server, it can take a few minutes for that to take effect. So although we made the assignment, it may not be in such a way that we'll know right away. The way we'll know is when we click on Test Connection. What we should get is successfully connected to Exchange Web Services, and it did that based on this particular account that we gave that role to. And if I were to change this username to, say, John Smith, where we did not assign the that impersonation role, when we try to test the connection, we get the error that the account does not have permission to impersonate the requested user. And although this seems a little odd, we're using John Smith and we're trying to impersonate John Smith. John Smith has not been provided that role. So when we come back and use the account, that was assigned impersonation, then we're able to successfully connect. Now, we're pretty much done, except that we want to do two things. For impersonate as, we want to impersonate as the user that the message is coming from. Now, I'm going to bring the mail from RRT. This will be in our sample config, the user that we're actually going to say, this is who I want this message to come from. When I click test connection, you'll see that we get an error that we're unable to connect to Exchange Web Server. Error, the SMTP address format is invalid. So it's actually looking at what's inside of this field, and it's determining that an RRT, it's not able to test right now what that is, but if we were to actually type something in that is a valid email address for the Exchange server, then we do test OK. So we want to use this just to test, and then once we're done testing, we can bring that RRT in and we're good. Now, the last thing that we want to do is we want to save the copies of messages into the sent items folder. So what this basically will let us do is whoever I send this email from, as I'm sending it from or impersonating that user, then it will send over the message to the person that we want it to go to, and it'll also place an item into the sent items folder. So one thing I'd like to mention real quick about impersonation, and that is that impersonation differs from delegation in that a delegate account performs actions on behalf of a primary account. So an impersonating account performs those actions as if it were that primary account. With Exchange impersonation, one account is acting as another account. When an account is impersonated, the system logs the access as if the account that is specified in the header were acting on the system. The calling account must have the appropriate permissions in order to do that. In this case, the calling account is going to be administrator. So we're done with setting up the Exchange Web Service configuration. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now that's in the General tab. Let's move over to the Message tab, and we're going to say that the message is going to come from this user. It's going to go to whoever we select. And for the subject, we'll just call that test impersonation, and we'll go ahead and pre-populate the body of the email message. All right, so let's go ahead and click OK. We'll click OK, OK, and let's go ahead and save this configuration file. I've got a folder already set up, and we'll call this Impersonation Exchange Web Services. Save that. And now we'll go ahead and start the service. So move that down, and we've got our status monitor running. Now what we'll do is we'll go ahead and send over a test file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send this file over to our config, and we're going to say that the message is going to come from John Smith, and let's send the message over to Mary Jones. So I'll go ahead and send that over. Status monitor should show that it's preparing the message and that it was successfully sent, as we've got right there. All right, so let's go ahead and log into Mary's email inbox, and let's see what that looks like. All right, so here is our sample message with the subject line pre-populated, and the message came from John Smith. You'll notice that it doesn't say it came from administrator, but it actually came from John Smith. So let's go ahead and close this. We're going to sign out, and let's go to John Smith's. All right. When I go to the Sent Items folder, you'll see that here I have that message that was just sent, and it was sent over to Mary Jones. All right, no indication that it was administrator that did the sending of the message, or in the case of a service account, that it was actually the service account that actually did that. Now, one final thing that we'll look at before we wrap this up is we'll move over to our Exchange server and let's take a look at some logs. All right, so on the Exchange server, I'm going to go ahead and exit out of the Exchange Management shell, and we're going to open up the Exchange Management console. All right, so when I expand this, I'm going to go to the toolbox, and I'm going to go to Message Tracking. Under Mail Control, there's a section here called Delivery Reports. And what I want to do is I want to search for John Smith. And I want to search for the message that were sent to Mary Jones. All right, so I could also search on some other criteria such as where messages came from or anything particular in the subject line. And down here is where the results would show. So I'm going to click on Search. And you'll notice that here I've got a couple of messages, and this one here that we just sent called Test Impersonation, which was sent at this time, said that it came from John Smith and it went to Mary Jones. And one other thing I'll do before we close this out, I'll go ahead and say let's search for administrator. And in the case where the service account was administrator and that's what sent the message to Mary Jones, we're going to search for any messages that came from administrator that were sent to Mary Jones. So when I click on search, you'll notice that down on the bottom there are no items to show in this view. So by configuring the service account to impersonate, we're letting Exchange handle the impersonation for that. And when that happens, the service account that is impersonating is acting on behalf of the user that's actually going to send the mail, versus delegating the access. It's actually impersonating. I hope this has been informative, and until next time, thanks for watching.